Mr. Ron Dunn.
All right. Well, as Hutch said, we're this fall we're going to do a focus on everything through each of the talkings. We're looking at it vertically. Why did God give the 10 Commandments carved in stone? From a vertical standpoint, what did God have in mind that this was so good? Abiding in Him vertically. And I was drawn to Philippians this summer. I was drawn really into Philippians this summer. I've enjoyed looking at it immensely. It seems to me that we are in a season of attack. In this room, marriages are under attack. Some marriages are on ice. From the pit of hell, Satan's trying to break up marriages. Families are under attack. Guys' faith, their joy is under attack. I can tell you that this ministry was under attack coming into this season like no other season ever. And Philippians is a town that was under attack. It was not friendly to Jews. It was certainly not friendly to Christians. It was a colonized Roman city. In fact, it was called Small Rome. And so this book is going to just be filled with all kinds of applications for us at this time for what we're going through. You know, if it's not bad enough what Satan's doing in our families and in our marriages and to us as men, I mean, we're getting piled on, right? We have a country, we have media, we have politicians that are calling evil good and good evil. And they're calling darkness light and light dark and bitter sweet and sweet bitter. The world's upside down. So this fall, we're going to turn where we need to turn, and that is vertically. How does God view all this? What is He up to? We're told as things get worse, look up, right? So we are going to look up vertically. Today we're going to do an introduction into Philippians. And really, to understand Philippians properly, we need to go back about 3 or 4 years, from the time when Paul first set foot into Philippi. So what do you picture? What age was Paul when he went to Philippi? Anybody? What do you picture? Yeah, well, very good. I pictured him like my age, like ancient, right? He was 45. He was 45 when he went to Philippi. So here's what kind of led up to this, right? The Christians were scattered after Saul was part of the stoning of Timothy. He was a young stud at the time. And then the Pharisees recruited him to persecute the Christians and to kill Christians. Well, after his conversion, nobody knew exactly what to think about Paul. He was trained for 3 years out in the desert, and he came back. He was tent making. He was speaking sometimes. Well, Barnabas goes to Antioch in Syria, 300 miles north of Jerusalem. And he's starting a ministry there, and he said, man, I need help. So he goes to Tarsus. And he knew that Paul was anointed. He knew that Paul had a special gift for preaching. So he brought Paul back to Antioch. And together, it says, they preached so powerfully that the city was being converted, Jews and Gentiles. Amazing things were happening in Antioch. And so Paul and Barnabas get commissioned by the elders, by all the apostles, to say, go on a missionary journey. Let's take this word out to Asia, over to Cyrus. And so they grab John Mark, and they go on this missionary journey. And it's really interesting that you discover that what Paul does is he develops a rhythm for sharing Jesus. And I looked at this summer, and I was convicted by that. Read it in Acts 13 if you want to see Paul's rhythm. It's concise. It relates. And I asked myself, do I do that? We had a guy who came here he moved to North Carolina, Enoch. You ever go to lunch with Enoch? He's going to witness to the waitress. And I watched him, I was like, that's really amazing. He does it concise, but he just draws them. He tells his story. Nobody can deny our story, right? Tell your story. So what Paul did, and I don't have time to unpack it this morning, but read it in Acts 13. He took the Jewish history and he can put it down in concise. On Sunday at church, my wife and I sat next to a lady. She said, just call me Z. Her name's Azita. She's from Iran. Her dad and her went to a meeting together. And somebody at the meeting told the story of Esther to these Persians, to these Iranians. And her dad sat there. She says, my dad was very refined, businessman, well thought of, high intellect guy. And he sat there and she said, he kept looking at me saying, this guy's right. This guy's right. He was telling the story about how the Jews almost got wiped out. But then Esther came along for such a time as this. And he's going, that's right, that's part of our history. And so her dad was so amazed at what this guy knew. And what he was doing was leading to the fact that through the Jews came Jesus. And Jesus is our salvation. He's the only way. He's God's son. And so she ends up accepting Christ. She said, I was always intrigued by who Jesus was, but nobody ever told us. And so she accepts Christ, and then her dad accepts Christ. She has to now leave Iran or she's going to be beheaded, right? So she leaves. She's here with her daughters now, and her dad has since passed. Her mom, not converted, wants nothing to do with them now. But what an amazing story. And this is the same type of thing that Paul did. He went to the Jews and invited the Gentiles. But read what happened in Antioch of Pisidia. So he goes and he goes through his rhythm. He starts at the flood. He says, he starts in Egypt. And he says, we grew, us Jews, we grew as a nation under the protection of the Egyptians. But then God, by his powerful hand, took us out of slavery. And then he tolerated us for 40 years. But then he conquered 7 nations and gave us the land as an inheritance. He also gave us judges. So he was going to rule the Israelites just through the judges, telling the judges what to tell us. But we begged him for a king. And so he said, okay. And he gave us Saul for 40 years. But then he raised up David. And he said, this guy, David, he's a man after my own heart. He'll do what I tell him to do. And listen, Jews, from David came our Messiah. And our Messiah was Jesus Christ. Now, John the Baptist came. Everybody knows John the Baptist. He preached repentance. Everybody thought, are you the Messiah? And he said before he died, no, I'm not. One comes after me whose shoes I can't even tie. Then Jesus came. And our leaders didn't recognize him. And they killed him. But he rose from the dead, and a lot of people have seen him. We have witnesses who have seen him. I've seen him. And he's our salvation. You can be right through God right now. No more need for sacrifice because he paid it all if you accept Jesus. And there was conversion after Jews and Gentiles. So he's in this Antioch of Pisidia, and they said, hey, can you come back next week? This is unbelievable. Can you come back next week and teach again? So he said, okay, yeah, we'll hang out. The next Sunday, it said the entire town came out to hear what Paul had to say. And so Paul speaks, and the battle line forms. And guys, this happens still today, right? We can be involved in a lot of things, competition, whatever. There's no real battle line. There's no spiritual battle line. But if we want to talk about this, everything that God has done and how God operates vertically, then we're going to have opposition. And this opposition is going to recruit other opposition. And so here he's in Antioch for the second week. and an argument breaks out. A lot of people are converted, but Satan stirs up a few guys who bring in a few more guys, Jews and Gentiles, and they say, this is evil. This is not true. This is against every teaching that we've had. We need to kill these guys. So they plan to stone them. Paul and Barnabas escape, and they go to a little town called Lystra. At Lystra, again, Paul goes into his rhythm, and people are listening to it, and he looks and he sees a guy, and he's been lame since birth, and he realizes that guy's ready to accept Christ right now. And so he looks at him, he says, stand up and walk. And so the guy gets up and he walks, and everybody freaked out. And so they said, these guys, now there's a Greek temple in Lystra, and so they went through that filter, and they went, these guys are God incarnate. Paul is Paul is Zeus, and Barnabas is Hermes. And so they go get the priest, the Greek priest, and they're bringing a bull, and they're going to sacrifice to Paul and Barnabas and worship, and they tear their clothes and went, no, we're just men like you. Just like that, the battle line forms. Satan recruits. We got to put an end to this, right? So he recruits Jews and Gentiles both, and they get together and they talk. Some of the guys from Antioch came down because they're looking for these two guys to stone them. They get a crowd and they say, that's not good, that's evil. There's only two options. For somebody to heal a man, either it's from God or it's from Satan. They're not from God. What they teach is heresy. So they beat Paul and they beat Barnabas. They then stone Paul, and they think he's dead, and they drag him outside the city, and they leave him in the rubble. The new converts come out, and they're all standing around Paul looking at him. Everybody thinks he's dead. He pops up, and he goes inside the city. Now, what would you do at that point? The next morning, he took off to Derbe, and then he went, no, wait a minute. And he turned around, and he went right back to Lystra. And then he went right back to Antioch. Why? Because with him, everything was about serving him. Paul, from the best I can see, he never forgot what Jesus did. He never forgot what Jesus saved him from, the life that he had and who he is today. It changed him forever. And so he also we know this from his writing. We did the 59 one another's. We have to encourage, all these new Christians, they need to come back and see, I'm okay. God's all powerful. We're still doing his work. I'm going back to encourage the Christians. He got beaten, stoned, and left for dead. He goes, walks right back into the city. So they go back and do that. Then first missionary journey's done. They go back to Antioch, and wouldn't you know it, there's always spiritual warfare. Some men come to Antioch and say, hey, you Gentiles, if you really want to be saved, you got to be circumcised. They're like, what? They go, yeah, God's command, you got to be circumcised. And people were confused, like, what? And Paul and Barnabas said, no. Jesus did everything for us. There's no need for circumcision. It's an option for you. It has nothing to do with salvation. And the church leaders are like, I tell you what, guys, why don't you go to Jerusalem, get the apostles together, get the elders together, get church leaders. You guys have a council, and then come back and tell us what is God's position on this. So they go back, and it's the Jerusalem Council. And the Jerusalem Council meets. It's all the apostles, and it's the leaders. And it says they talk for a long time, and then Peter gets up and says, God's called me to the Gentiles. Why would we burden them by putting another rule on them that God didn't give? And then Paul and Barnabas get up and they start telling stories. Let me tell you what's going on with the Gentiles. Here's what happened in Antioch. Here's what happened in Lystra. Here's what happened. And they start telling stories of amazing things that happened. And then James, Jesus' brother, who has become the leader of the whole group, has the final word. And he said, here's the letter we're going to send. No, you don't have to. A Gentile does not have to become a Jew. And guys, let me remind you, if you're witnessing to Jews, they don't have to become a Gentile. They can still be fully Jewish. They're just now worshiping Yeshua as their Messiah. It connects a dot. I've seen it in our industry. Practicing Jews, now worshiping Jesus, still Jewish, still go to their synagogue. Fine. They're worshiping Jesus. They're bringing him there. That's everything, right? And so they clear things up. They send out a letter. Paul and Barnabas go back to Antioch. They're going to hang out for a while. We're going to Philippi. and then they decide to go, let's go second missionary journey. Barnabas says, let's take John Mark. Paul's like, no, there's no way we're taking John Mark. He abandoned us about a third way in on the first one. I'm not taking him again. We're going farther out. And they got into a heated argument. Well, John Mark was the nephew of Barnabas, so he's sticking up for his nephew. And so they separate over it. Barnabas, John Mark go one way. Paul grabs a guy named Silas and says, let's go. And where's the first place he goes? Lystra. He goes back to that town again. Why did he go there? Timothy was there. Timothy had a Greek dad, a Jewish mom, sharp kid, loved the Lord. Paul saw something in him, said, I'm taking this kid under my wing. He's coming with me. And so grabs Timothy. They're going. The plan is to go to Asia. And the Holy Spirit says, no, shut your mouth. Don't want you to speak. Don't want you talking to the Asians right now. All right, we'll go north to Bithynia. Nope, ain't going there. Where are we going? Paul has a dream. He has a dream, and there's a guy in Macedonia over in Greece saying, hey, come over here. We need to hear about Jesus. We need to know who Jesus is. So he wakes up. Let's read the story. Take out your bifold. By the way, I put down that theme verse for a reason. The Jerusalem Council, the letter they sent out was that here's Gentiles. Here's 4 things for you. Do not be sexually immoral. Because a lot of churches were teaching that sex was part of worship. And they had prostitutes that you would worship with. And so they clarified it. Do not be sexually immoral. Do not eat food offered to idols, strangled animals, or blood. That's all 3 in 1 right there. Why was that important? Because they wanted to realize it has nothing to do with salvation. It has to do with our fellowship together, okay? It has to do with Jews and Gentiles be able to eat together without anything in the way. So they're removing things. The theme verse for this introduction is do everything without complaining or arguing over minor things so that no one can criticize you. Why? Because it gets in the way of everything. If you're a person who's complaining and arguing all the time, it gets in the way of everything. And what we're going to see with Paul as he speaks to these Philippians, he writes a letter to them, and every chapter he uses the word everything. And he's bringing all of life into perspective on everything. He starts out by saying, I'm a slave of Jesus Christ. That's verse 1, chapter 1. I'm a slave. This is from Paul and Timothy. We are slaves of the Lord Jesus Christ. Well, wait a minute. Paul, you're a slave of Rome when you're writing this. You have a soldier chained to your wrist 24 hours a day. No. I'm a slave of Jesus Christ. That's what everything is, no matter what our circumstances is. And so part of what he writes to them is do everything without complaining. Don't let little things get in your way, because it gets in the way of everything. So here's what happens when they come to Troas. Let's read it real quick. Troas Experience. That night, Paul had a vision. A man from Macedonia in northern Greece was standing there pleading with him, come over to Macedonia to help us. After Paul saw the vision, we got ready at once to leave for Macedonia. Who's we? Who wrote Acts? Luke, right? So how did Luke show up? Well, Luke was in the Jerusalem Council. Luke heard Paul and Barnabas share all these amazing stories. He's a writer. He was writing down everything he could about the new startup, the new Christian church. So he took off and caught up with Paul, Silas, and with Timothy so he could record all this stuff. So now he's putting himself into the story. We got ready at once and left for Macedonia, concluding that God was calling us to preach the good news there. We boarded a boat at Troas and sailed straight across to the island of Samothrace, and the next day we landed at Neapolis. From there, we reached Philippi, a major city, that district of Macedonia, and a Roman colony, and we stayed there several days. They only stayed in Philippi several days, yet relationships were formed that last the rest of Paul's life. And we're going to get into that as we get into these 4 chapters. In 2 Corinthians, as Paul's writing to the Corinthians, look at chapter 8 this weekend. You know what he does in chapter 8, half the chapter? He brags about the Philippians. He says, you want to know what a generous heart is? These people are poor. These people are generous. And he talks about them for 8 verses. Some things happened here in a matter of a few days that built a relationship forever. We know what that's like, right? So before moving forward, I'm just going to throw a question out. The Troas Experience. Have you ever had an experience like that where you don't know where to go? It seems like every door is closed. And you're wondering, God, where am I supposed to go? It's not just a Bible story. This is our living God who tells us these stories, so we know that this is who he is and this is how he acts. Troas Experience. You want to have a great breakfast or a great lunch? A great breakfast or a great lunch with another guy has to do with a great question. It really does. What questions are you going to ask each other during this time when you're breaking bread together? Part of what we're encouraged by, part of what defeats Satan is the power of testimony. This is one of the things you could talk about. When was there a time in your life when you had a Troas experience? You weren't sure what to do, but God showed up. Anybody have a time like that? We all probably have, right? All right, I need to move along, so I'm going to go real quick right now. You can look at a couple verses there that show that. So they now come to the city of Philippi for the first time, okay? Now, here's the city of Philippi. A lot of history there. It's in Greece, colonized by Rome. The biggest war ever fought in Roman history was a civil war that was fought in Philippi. It was when the Roman Republic was going against Caesar's army. So it was Brutus and Cassius for the Roman Republic against Octavian, who became Augustus Caesar, and John Mark. 200,000 soldiers, 60,000 men died in a valley outside of Philippi. And so Caesar took power in Rome. Okay, and then they made this little town of Philippi a retirement community. So it became a place where soldiers would retire. If you were a soldier in the Roman army, free land, tax-free land in Philippi. So this town became known as Small Rome. It was a tough place to live. Roman soldiers were a gritty group. They're all living there, okay? So if you're a Jew living there, or if you're going to now soon become a Christian, Paul knew the life he was going to call people into. But because it's not about here, but it's about, he's seen what everything's about, he goes right into the teeth of it because God called him to go there. He comes to the town. If in those days, if to have a synagogue, you had to have 10 Jewish families. Then they have a synagogue. They didn't even have 10 Jewish families in that town. So the Jews, the ones that were there, were meeting out by a river for prayer and for worship. So Paul goes there. He meets Lydia. Lydia owned a fine linen company. She was wealthy. Paul goes through his rhythm. She accepts Christ. All of her servants accept Christ. Her entire household accepts Christ. And then she says to these 4 guys, stay with me. I've got a big place. Stay with me. They're like, no. I insist. Stay with me. So they're only there for a few days. They stay at Lydia's place. Every day they're getting up. They're walking back to the river. And people are gathering to hear, what is this? What? This is and there's a possessed lady who follows them. And she starts yelling out, these men are apostles of God. They're here to tell you how to be saved. Possessed woman. Paul turns around, he's aggravated, and he casts the demon spirit out of her. Why would he do that? What she was saying was good, right? But he's experienced this. People will turn in a hurry. If they say they must be evil because this evil woman is saying they're good, he knew that, so he had to take it out, right? So what did Satan do? He's going to try to stop what's going on in Philippi immediately. So he takes the owner. And so this lady was a sorcerer, a fortune teller. He was making all kinds of money on her. So he goes to the court and says, hey, he just took away my income. You need to punish these guys. They ruined my slave. And so the magistrate decides, let's have them whipped. So Paul and Silas are whipped. And then he said, throw them in jail, chain them to a stone, make sure they don't escape. That night, they're singing worship. Paul, because he's about everything. His perspective is everything, period. It's about him. I know he called me here. I know I'm doing his work. So this is a hiccup. They're chained. The guard's house is connected to the jail. That's how it was at those times. There's an earthquake at midnight. The chains fall out. The doors open. The head guard wakes up, comes running out, and sees all the doors open. He takes out his sword because he's going to die a horrible death if all of his prisoners escape. He takes the sword to kill himself, and Paul says, hey, stop. We're still here. We didn't run away. And so Paul goes into his rhythm. This guy accepts Christ, takes him next door. His whole family accepts Christ. And then word goes back to the magistrate, these 2 guys are Roman citizens. So they send word, let them go. Just let them go. Paul said, no, not going anywhere. Magistrate, you need to come. We need to have a city meeting, and you need to let the people know we did nothing wrong. Why? Was that important to Paul? He was in a battle town, and he had to take any opposition that Satan would have and knock it down to the ground so that it was clear for him to give a testimony. Why? Because he was about everything, always about everything. So this is the city of Philippi. I'm going to send it to the tables. I put a lot of verses in here. Number one, the perspective of everything. It's a common theme. Paul writes about it in Corinthians. He writes about it in Colossians. He writes about it in Romans. He writes about it in Ephesians. He writes about it in every chapter in Philippians. Whatever you eat or drink, whatever you do everything to the glory of God. Everything Look at Romans. We know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. God put everything under Jesus' feet and made him the head over everything for the church's body. What's he saying there? Jesus is the head of everything, and guess what? We're his body, which means we're here to physically represent him on this planet until he brings us home. Paul never forgot that. And so he lived his life that way, and that's how he entered into this tough town and made sure that the slate was clear. Paul's not the only one. Look at that verse from Peter. Do you have the gift of speaking? Then speak as God himself were speaking through you. Do you have the gift of helping others? Do it with the strength and energy that God supplies. Then everything you do will bring glory to God through Jesus Christ. All glory, power to him forever and ever. Amen. All right. On the final page there, take it home and look at it, just pulling some verses from Philippians. This is where we're going to be going as we look at each one of these chapters. Philippi is an amazing, amazing book. It speaks to people who are constantly under attack and under pressure, and it puts it in perspective. Spend time with it. Ask God to give you this kind of heart, this kind of insight, this kind of worldview for who he is and how he's acted. Guys, let's be vertical in our faith, all right? Table leaders, I'll hand it over to you. We'll come back and close. Just 4:8. All right, guys, let's pull together. Just a couple of things real quick in closing. I hope you had a good discussion at your table. We had a really good discussion. And, one of the things that Joe brought up was like, so Paul, I mean, we talked as a table how amazing it was that he would be stoned, get up, and then go right back, right? And so the question was speculation to some degree, I guess. Did he ever have a moment? Did he ever have a moment like, am I doing, is this worth it? Should I just get out of here? And perhaps, right? I mean, he did head to Derby first, but then what in him turned him around to head right back to Lystra? And lest we put him too high up on the pedestal, it was the Holy Spirit inside of him, right? What happened on Pentecost changed everybody, and they're given a power and a boldness that was absolutely incredible. Well, one of my convictions this summer has been that, I look at what Paul did. I looked at the conviction. I looked at even consider what he knew, the life he was going to give these converts in that town of Philippi, and what they were going to end up going through, which we're going to get through as we go through it, and what his advice and what his words to them were. And why am I, when I see a guy on a bench who's clearly downtrodden, why am I fearful to go up and sit down next to him and say, how's it going? Let me share something with you that changed my life. Or ask the waitress. One thing that again, I took from Enoch, the waitress would come by, and the waitress may, appear heavy in spirit. And so he would say, hey, we got a bunch of guys here who are going to be praying in a minute. Is there anything we can pray for you? And every time the waitress would open up and say, yeah, you can pray for da, 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 da. And we have that type of opportunity. So yeah, Paul is an inspiration to all of us to say, let's think about everything. And we do some things here to help you with that, right? We have a tetelestai hat. Greg Powers shared with me. He's at a golf event, and the lady pro comes up and says, "What is that on your hat?" She just asked Greg to tell him what Jesus said on the cross. Paid in full, it's finished. And so he gets to share the story. She's like, "How do I get a hat like that?" And so we do things to help spur that. That's why we do swag, right? Is to help spur that on. So if you wear Tetelestai, if you wear OT for M, if you're gonna wear an everything hat or whatever, it's gonna spur conversation. My challenge to you, if you end up getting an everything hat and someone says, "What is everything?" Well, first of all, it's everything, period, for a reason. Now you develop your story by pouring yourself into these everything verses that are on your bifold. Spend some time with it. Get on your bench. Say, "God, what do you speak? What do you have for me? What do you have for me in this? What's the perspective that I need? How do I need to realize that you are in charge of everything?" Greg?
Read Philippians 4:8-9 out loud. There you go. We discussed it at the table, Philippians 4:8-9, which is the last paragraph on the third page. And now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about the things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Keep putting into practice all you have learned and received from me, everything you heard from me and saw me doing. Then the God of peace will be with you. It's such a powerful paragraph.
It's all right. Yeah.
If we focus on all of those things that are righteous and true.
The whole book is about perspective like that, and thanks for sharing that. I mean, when we get into chapter 1, the Philippians write him and say, "Hey, you're in prison, we're worried about you." And they send Epaphroditus with gifts and money. "Continue on, Paul." He writes back and says, "Know this, everything that has happened to me has happened for a reason. Everyone that I've come in touch with in prison knows who Jesus Christ is." These guys chained to my wrist, they're saved, and their families are saved. What a perspective, right? I mean, what a recalibration for all of us as we go on in our days and what we do. Hey, we work to make money, we work to provide. But what really happens is this, and if I had time, and I knew I was running out of time, and there was so much to pack into an introduction in the first week, but these are nestle dials. So what I was gonna do, but I had a microphone in my hand, I only had one hand. If you take these out, there's 6 more inside of each one of these. And what I want to show is that when Paul shared, 6 people got saved. And when Silas spoke, 6 people got saved. But at the same time, Satan realizes what's going on, and he sends 6 demons, and he ignites 6 more people to come against. That's our life. That is our life. And God has put us where we are, the contacts that we have, the family that we're in, the neighborhood that we're in, the place that we work, to be the light, to bring perspective that everything, period, is under Jesus' feet. He's in charge of absolutely everything. And from that everything, we get perspective if we look up and we're vertical. Where are you at in that dynamic? I'm convicted here. I bought into something that I was taught by my mentors. Witness at all times, speak when necessary. It's good wisdom. I bought too much into speak when necessary. And it gives me license to shut my mouth when my mouth should be open. God's given me a decent personality. Use it, right? That's true about everybody in this room. Use it. Don't be fearful. Thankfully, in today's world, we're not getting beaten, stoned, and left for dead outside of Alpharetta city limits. But what's going to happen is someone hurting is going to go, "Yeah, you can pray for me." What's your story? Nobody can deny your story. All right, we've gone long today. Thank you, guys. Close at your table. We'll be back next week with Hutch on Carved in Stone.